Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Greetings, Patriots, and welcome to the China Desk, hosted by Federal Newswire. This is our maiden podcast where we talk about all things China policy, and I'm honored today to have from the Daily Caller News Foundation Philip Lenczycki, who is an investigative journalist who's done a great deal of work looking at some of the Chinese Communist Party's influence operations in the United States. And so first, Philip, I'd like to ask a few questions about how you came to this line of work of investigative journalism and the China angles coming together. So what brought you into this space to cover things like this for the Daily Caller News Foundation?
Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me on the show. I'm honored. This is a dream come true, and congratulations. Now, as for my journey to the Daily Caller News Foundation, I lived overseas growing up. And I eventually had the great fortune of traveling to China. And in the beginning, that wasn't something that was on my radar as being my future career path. But over time, bit by bit, returning again and again, and eventually having the opportunity to first work and then to study, it became my calling. And so journalism was always sort of a parallel career path. And came and went with different moments of my life, and the opportunity to try to go forward with it full on. I embraced that, and I thought that out of all the outlets that I wanted to try it with, call me crazy, but I there's something about the Daily Caller that I resonate with. So that's that.
All good. Well, Daily Caller is a place that was founded by some good friends. One of them now a household name in Tucker Carlson. Neil Patel was a colleague of mine in the White House in the Bush administration. I was there for 5 years. Neil stayed for the full 8. One of the most intelligent guys I've ever met. And they were launched by a very wonderful friend named Foster Friese, who generously helped get things rolling. And so what a great combo to get that enterprise moving forward. The Caller had been kind of known for a time for breaking some of the hard-hitting, concise stories, but you're doing the long form. You're doing longer pieces, multi-episode pieces that are going after some big topics. And that's how our paths came together. I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of that state of investigative journalism and kind of where you see your niche and the Daily Caller News Foundation's niche on this, because when I was a young man, there was an investigative journalist kind of or more associated with a lot of the big outlets. These people would take deep dives on major issues of the day. You would think in our lifetimes, China would be one of those big issues of the day. And what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in the United States itself would be something that mom and pops around the country would really want to see in their local and national copy. And yet, I think you're kind of one of the first of a kind that's really blazing this path of looking at these influence operations in the United States. So talk to me a little bit about that investigative journalism piece and how you see it fitting into the public policy square, and then the home you've found with that niche with the Daily Caller News Foundation.
Sure, I'll do my best to try and answer those questions. I look around and, part of the genesis of how I find myself to be where I am is that there's only so many individuals who went to China or Taiwan and tried to take up sort of a study of that skill set. And so at the end of the day, my colleagues, they went on to business and to other types of endeavors, but not many went and tried to apply that to media. So that's one component. I believe that we unfortunately, despite everything that's going on in the world, remain as a society quite ignorant of what's occurring and what the motivations are with the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think that there's a lot of work to do there. So when I see that type of opportunity, I like hard work, and that seems like a perfect fit for me. The Daily Caller has been really very open to the types of stories, and they've been perhaps far too trusting, but they've been trusting in what I go after, and they've been not entirely listening to me, obviously, but it's been a good fit, so that I think that they're making the most out of my background. I think that right now, unfortunately, you're correct. There aren't enough investigative reporters who are applying themselves in this direction. To sort of bring the two topics together, that might also have to do with the outlets they work for.
Right.
I really mean this, that there is no one telling me what I can and can't write, who I can and not go after. I don't think that's necessarily
it's real journalism.
Right. I don't think that's the same at other places. I'm sure that they have certain taboo subjects. So when the day occurs that I'm told, no, we can't go after them, they're a donor or something like that, I'll let you know.
Yeah. Well, that is the beauty of the enterprise you're engaged in, that it is, in fact, real journalism, and you're really sinking your teeth into a policy subject matter that does need to be really informed. I mean, all of us that go through a journey of being in elected office or appointed office, or in some form or fashion a public figure, you are subject to a lot of influences, and you're trying to digest things real time all the time, and you can get these brief news stories and you sort of live in a cycle, but to go beyond the cycle takes something really compelling and well presented. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the targets of your investigative journalism, some of the big pieces. I want the audience to know that you have been awarded by the Daily Caller News Foundation for some of the groundbreaking work that you've done. And so talk a little bit about this niche of looking at what Chinese Communist Party influence operations are in the United States, which I think are the things that you and I have talked about most in the work over the course of the last few months.
Indeed. Yeah, my interest with China, of course, I love the food and whatnot, but academically speaking, I came to really find my intellectual home looking into the Communist Party, and then looking at the current lay of the land in the United States. I've been trying to understand how it is that it seems that so many of our institutions are, to use sort of a hackneyed phrase at this point, kowtowing to the whims of China. And so by trying to just poke around and kind of grok what's going on, there turns out to be, in my humble estimation, someone behind the curtain, if you will, and that entity, I'm sure, goes by the names of a number of different Chinese Communist Party, departments. But one of them that we've been, hammering away at as of late is the United Front Work Department. And so this Chinese government agency is responsible for more or less trying to manage non-party individuals. And that could manifest in coercion, or it could manifest in bribery, or in a number of different, carrot or stick type methods. And in the United States, we're seeing their touch upon, I believe, every sector. And so some of my investigations have dealt with government individuals. We did a long investigation into the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a think tank in Washington, D.C., that I'm sure some in your audience are quite familiar with. Current CIA Director William Burns was the president of Carnegie beginning in 2015, and continued until his appointment as CIA director, and that began in 2021, February, I believe, was his hearing. And so looking into the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, we found that there were 20 members of the Chinese Communist Party that were in his employ during his tenure. furthermore, as we continue to look at in that direction, we found that there were some dozen or so members of this United Front Work Department related to the Ministry of State Security apparatus that were also right around in their employ. And this is both at their DC headquarters as well as their Beijing headquarters at Tsinghua University. So that's one of the investigations that we did. And there have been a number of others that looked at individuals in the business sector, such as we had one early on that was looking at Stephen Schwartzman.
Yeah, well, you're in an area that I think people know a little bit about and maybe are not familiar with the extent that it has really developed in the United States. People think of sort of spy versus spy, and you think of the Cold War and cloak and dagger stuff or James Bond or whatever else. This is actually much more sophisticated, in some ways much more successful, in that there are a wide range of tools that a hostile party might use. Now, lots of people know that if you want to try to control someone, you could just walk up and inflict pain upon them. I don't know how effective that is. Or you could induce them with something that they want, whether that is love, in air quotes, or money, or access, or an audience, some sense of prestige. And I think people know that if you're a high-profile leader, whether you're a corporate leader or a political leader or a government leader, that you're going to be a target of people wanting to influence you and control you. But I think when they read or see on TV, or even in a humble podcast, someone from a think tank talking, they think these are the towers of professors without classrooms. These are the experts that have studied this subject matter in depth, and they're here to kind of educate policymakers and to speak on behalf of the country and sometimes the grassroots to influence policy. And what you're telling us is, through your investigation, is that some of these think tanks are being influenced by a hostile foreign power, even a communist party. And not only are they possibly receiving the influence effort, they're employing some of these people. And so the compromise, whether it takes place on Capitol Hill and some of those infamous headlines that come from particular members of Congress, it extends down to the classroom and into the think tank and out into the fruited plain. There's the unidentified, or I should say the anonymous police station that came and went in Brooklyn and other kinds of areas. So I think this is a really, really fruitful area, but also one that I think too few Americans want to believe is true. I mean, we'd like to go about our everyday lives. I remember when I was just a humble think tanker back in the 1990s, and I'd have friends from China that would come by, and you'd want to host them in your house, and then you'd go on some kind of a delegation, and they would host you when you went over to China. You'd have banquets and talks, and it all seemed very innocuous. But then later you learn, oh my goodness, they thought I was a part of the intelligence community, even though I had left it, but they really were a part of the intelligence community, and they never left it. And so unless there's more investigation and more education, we're never really going to get our system right. We're too open and friendly and naive, perhaps, and our enemies take advantage of it. Anyway, end of discourse on that subject. Let's talk a little bit more about sort of what, for you to pursue this subject matter, you're essentially identifying the Chinese Communist Party as a hostile force, an enemy, what have you. I'll let you pick your own word about how you see the Communist Party and why you see it that particular way. I think it's important to kind of get that framing because for you to do what you're doing, you're obviously not going out there to beat a drum about sort of an innocent party that's here to just make friends and make money.
Yeah, it's quite evident at this point that they are a hostile force. They are vicious, and we should be extremely concerned about what they are capable of doing to us in light of the fact of what they are routinely doing to their own people. So having lived in China and traveled there for 20 years, am one of those individuals who, I think a period of time, was hopeful that things could be otherwise. And so I think that there was, a rosy period, at least in my cohort, where things were looking kind of bright until maybe around the 2008 Olympics. And then sometime thereafter, and as we got closer and closer to the entrance of Xi Jinping, and then definitely at that point, it became quite clear what we were actually dealing with, that they had no intention to go forward with any of the promises that they had made, or abide by any of the agreements that they had made. And so at that point, I think that there was an increasing level of scrutiny, and that it is a type of shame that I suppose that we all bear, where we knew about Tiananmen Square, we'd heard what was going on with Falun Gong and whatnot, but still wanted to see what could be. But at this point, there's only thing we can do at this point is to accept the horrible truth. I think that to sort of circle back briefly to something that we had said a moment prior, I think that one of the big reasons why this will not be, at least for the foreseeable future, an area that investigative reporters will really be able to dive into at the level it needs to be done, is that it's probably fear. That there is a type of fear involved, not just at a personal level that the Communist Party might come after you, God forbid, but that the truth of the matter is too horrible to actually face. That it could be this pervasive. And as you just said, Steve, that those individuals who you might yourself be learning from or working with and whatnot could also be compromised. It's something that requires some nuance to understand. Of course, we're not saying every Chinese person is an agent of the Communist Party. That's not the argument. But the threat really is at that level, that I believe that only those who are sort of prepared to steel themselves against that are going to be able to take it on.
Well, you've really hit a lot of themes there that resonate with my experience too. And I think I think in the broad genre of China studies, one of the big impulses was commerce, the make money. But then the other one was the missionary impulse, and not just in the theological or religious sense. Americans can, broadly speaking, be very open and idealistic and want to go out and engage the world and believe if we have interaction that we might add value. It might be positive sum. We can both benefit. And that we can have a reasonable and rational discourse and exchange. And obviously they'd see that I don't have horns and a cloven foot. I've not come to take away their women and children and their money. And yet it's almost impossible for someone who's grown up in a free society to really comprehend the very different existence that people in a party totalitarian environment are really operating under. Mm-hmm. On the facade, we see the glitz and glamour. They speak English brilliantly, and they can be very gracious hosts. And they stand on top of a glorious history. I would argue it's not theirs. The Communist Party doesn't deserve that. But to all those of us who come from the outside, there's a lot of good. There's a little bit of romance in that. And that's a positive thing. And that's what we share with Chinese people generally. But the party is different. And I think for a lot of us, it takes a moment in your life, in your career, in your own interactions where you kind of go, I didn't want to think it was going to be like this, but now I can't unsee it. And now there's no turning back. This is actually evil and destructive. And it's actually the enemy of the Chinese people, not just the United States and the free world. So for some of it, it takes more than one dose. And you're also quite right about the concerns about where you go. I think for you and what you're doing in journalism, for me, what I had done in politics, policy, business, or otherwise, there's huge opportunity cost. Once you openly go after these topics, there are a lot of people that are afraid to associate with you, much less hire you. Mm-hmm. And I think you're also right that at a gut level, Americans Christians, whatever your faith persuasion might be, you want to think the best of other people. You don't want to assume the worst, and you don't want to be treated that way in reverse. That there's definitely a lot of those personal and professional hurdles that we have to cross in looking at this. But as we look at it, one of the things that the America First Policy Institute's China Policy Initiative focuses on as a priority is, yes, there's this national security, trade and economic, federal and international element of all of this, but there's also this protect America first from the grassroots up level. And there have been some comings and going domestically, whether it's the Department of Justice having a China initiative of its own that was launched and then disbanded, so it was reported. There's this constant harangue that if you go after the Chinese Communist Party, then you're anti-Chinese. We lived through that all through COVID as well, that somehow the Chinese Communist Party could allow a virus to poison the world, kill millions of people, and steal trillions of dollars, and somehow that party and that government can't be touched because racism. So surely you've run into some of this in going after the topics you've pursued. Is there any kind of sizzly or interesting feedback you've gotten? Have lawyers needed to be engaged to protect your reputation?
Not much to protect, but that's a good place to start, I suppose, in this profession. But the answer is we have lawyers, and luckily I haven't had to be engaged in any type of lawsuit, but we are extremely fastidious in our investigations, and so it's been actually quite revealing, the deafening silence that follows. I would imagine that if someone was slandering you, you might say something about it, wouldn't you? However,
yeah,
one after another, there is crickets to be heard.
So what do you attribute that to? I mean, there's a public relations adage that you just let the news cycle run its course and go back to business, and maybe it's just that survival instinct for the people that are in the Leviathan, and that's why they just sort of take the hit and let it go. Do you think they try to marginalize the caller or just the story? But so far you haven't had any sort of email campaigns or unpleasant phone calls in response?
Don't give them any ideas, Steve. But not that I would care. I mean, it's just at this point, I just whatever. Fuck you guys. Pardon my French. But anyhow, so the issue is this: we are going to have to do what we're going to have to do. They can try to do what they're going to try to do, but ultimately, as you said prior, once you kind of put yourself out there at this level, we're going to have to see where the chips fall. And when you come to the realization that either you can be on the sidelines and feel like you are, just victimized in life and you got no say, you've got no agency, or that you can sort of, suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune and have at it. Well, this is the lot I've chosen, and I think that the Daily Caller is in the same fight. And you take some solace in the fact that you're surrounded by other individuals who want to do that. So that's where my heart is. I also think that, turning it around a little bit, that I think about it's really important, I think, to think about what it is that the Communist Party is and who the individuals are that are, the enemy, if you want to call it that. And that is, I think of them as hostages. I think of them as victims. I think of them as trapped in a system that is monstrous. If we think a little bit about Xi Jinping and what his life has looked like, for instance, his father, Xi Jinping, he was purged a number of times. Apparently, Xi Jinping's sister committed suicide because of the pressures of the Red Guard. And bit after bit, I think that, as it's been reported, he sort of decided somewhere along the way to become redder than red. And he draped himself in that as a means to protect himself. But at the end of the day, the system that they have there is like Game of Thrones, to borrow that. You either win or you die. And as we saw at the recent 20th Party Congress, even though you were Hu Jintao yesterday, top of the heap, tomorrow when you're not, you can get escorted out as though you're, yesterday's refuse. So they're playing for keeps because they have to. And so when I come to, think about things like that, I hope that there are individuals who are within that, who can do what has been, I'm not sure what the state of it today, but this whole, Tui Dang movement to reject the party and to reject the entire system, because it's a losing endeavor.
Yeah. It reminds me of the old Sting song of "I hope the Russians love their children too." We sort of hope that some of the Chinese that have been co-opted into the party, maybe they're true believers or what have you, can see the light, and for the sake of their people and their country, they can pull things in a different direction. But frankly, that's kind of why we need to stand on the side of seeing the party for what it is, seeing Xi Jinping for what he is. And we've got our own country, culture, jobs, family, and communities to save. And we would never have allowed our companies and our communities, our universities, our entertainment industries, our financial instruments to become this entangled with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And yet we have. Basically, we were the prime movers in bringing wealth, technology, engagement, and opportunity to China. The Chinese Communist Party didn't have a policy for modernizing. They had a policy to smelt all of their metal down into useless things. They destroyed families. They destroyed institutions of religion. That was what the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward were all about. And it's kind of one of these weird, twisted mind games that you have a top communist leader like Xi Jinping trying to be Mao 2.0 when Mao killed more Chinese people than anyone before, and destroyed the Chinese economy in massive ways. And if we hadn't breathed new life in with our engagement bet in the Nixon-Kissinger time, the Communist Party was on its deathbed. It was, talk about Game of Thrones. There was lots of things pulling in different directions, and succession was far from a guarantee post-Mao. So, but today, in some ways, I spent a lot of years where you had to convince people that you're not a conspiracy theorist if you want to say, oh, they're trying to influence us here. And like, oh, Americans are tough to influence. And, we're free people. We can have people come in and interact. But do you know whether they're interacting with your church? Do you know whether your retirement account is linked to funds that are tied to the Chinese Communist Party? Do you know whether the faculty at your university lives solely because of the filthy lucre that comes with strings attached that affects what classes and curriculum can be taught, can affect what kind of events you can have on your campus, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so many different angles to this. So one of the things that I have spent a lot of time looking at most recently is agricultural land and the resources that we have where governors and state officials generally can weigh in if our federal government is not. The CFIUS process, which is an acronym for a committee that is supposed to review investment into the United States to make sure we're not being compromised or weakened by an outside force. It is insufficient for the scope of this challenge with the Chinese Communist Party. So I was just in South Dakota with Governor Noem, who has a bill to try to launch a state-based version of this kind of review process. I think it's an idea worth a lot of consideration and adaptation in other states too. But where do you see sort of some next looks for your work? Are you looking more around sort of the Acela corridor of D.C. and New York? I mean, that's absolutely a target-rich environment. Or do you see looking out into the Confucius Institutes, the ag land, and other things, minerals or other things out in the States as another area that will be in your bailiwick?
I appreciate the question. I think that in my heart of hearts, the best stories that I can take on are the ones that awaken the American people to the reality that it's in their towns. It's on Main Street. And so the stories about the purchase of land, I think that that's a brilliant example. Perhaps America could have received no better wake-up call than COVID-19. The mishandling of COVID-19.
You would think.
Right. And, that dovetails with the idea that the Chinese Communist parties learned nothing from the days of Mao. We saw with them, of course, their handling of it. I mean, this was an epic disaster. And it's only by, well, we don't know the numbers yet, so we don't even know all told what has occurred. But in the end, I believe history will reflect that this was, on the scale of the horrors, similar to what occurred after they smelted all the iron and decided to rid themselves of pesky mosquitoes and sparrows and things like that, and then the famines that followed. I mean, this is a national disaster. So there's that aspect to it. I believe that, going forward, it's really important to, as I said, try to point out what's occurring in and around in every town. So personally, I think that the story that has, not come and gone, but was reported more or less as coming and going about the New York police station, I think that that's quite an interesting story. And there's no doubt in my mind that was not the only location. So I believe that that's an important story to show that these are elsewhere, and to show what the support structure is for these institutions. Because what we learned from this story was that in Manhattan, there was a Fujianese association called America Changlo Association that was hosting this overseas Chinese police station. They were working with the Chinese consulate, and they were working with the United Front Work Department and the propaganda department from Fujian to pull this off. You had the individual who's the former head of the America Changlo Association, Lu Jianwang, who went to China to participate in the launching of the Overseas Police Station Initiative. So I'm guessing that that's the exact same model that we're going to see elsewhere, that there are going to be these, hometown associations, if you want to call it that represent a certain part of China, that are going to be hosting these type of, Chinese government initiatives. I think that's really important that we suss this out in our communities. The whispers that I hear are that there are indeed additional locations, and I hope to find them.
Yeah. Well, it's really, really important, not just so that people can sort of learn how the Chinese Communist Party's United Front influence operations try to work, but, who exactly are they monitoring and trying to influence? We think of, number one, concept of reciprocity. We have no access to try to do anything like this in China. And so just as a matter of principle, we should be granting no quarter for them to have any access to do these kinds of things in our country. But we also fancy ourselves as a nation that welcomes the persecuted, the refugees, the dissidents. And so imagine someone who's been tortured or separated from their family because of their religious faith or their political wrongthink or whatever it was. They flee to the American dream, and they learn as they go, and come to find out the Chinese version of the Gestapo is hiding in plain sight right in a modern city. And just showing up within their vicinity is terrifying to these people and intimidating to these people. What if you happen to be an interesting professor who deigns to talk about human rights in China, the genocide against the Uyghurs, the crushing of Hong Kong, the holding of political prisoners in Hong Kong like Jimmy Lai, the former publisher of the Apple Daily? If you begin talking about these things, do these friendly neighborhood folks start showing up and paying a visit? Do they encourage those who support you to say, maybe think twice about continuing to support this questionable character? I mean, even back in the 1990s, when I was at the Heritage Foundation, I would occasionally get warnings from people who are in fundraising and development that a donor that might be in the corporate side of things was a little concerned about what I might be writing about Taiwan's security or its democracy and movement to freedom and things like that, and that it should be seen as an independent country something that apparently is forbidden in a country that, after all, was formed by a Declaration of Independence. So even in the 90s, some of these things would happen, and they'd mostly be indirect. They would use, for a lack of a better way of putting it, they would use a white guy to try to influence a white guy. They wouldn't put a Chinese face to try to convey the message and influence the targeted American. But now they're operating themselves inside the United States doing some of this, and it has to be chilling on the people who are Taiwanese, Uyghur, the religious refugees, and others. It's really quite stunning to me.
Those are really important points you just brought up. Number one, we've seen already in indictments that they have the Chinese Communist Party's agents, Ministry of State Security agents in New York, for instance. They know this, and they intentionally presented themselves. They posed as activists in order to infiltrate these types of communities. So that is most certainly occurring. I think that it's really important to try and be as real as we can about what the how pervasive this really is. And when we look around at what types of impacts these could have, I would really encourage your audience to go and look at some of their locally elected officials. There are out and about totally public records and reports that are really quite startling, that will show some of the support that they've been receiving from some of these sectors. And this is recent, for instance. I am not trying to cast any aspersions. However, while looking into America Changlo Association, for instance, we saw that New York City Mayor Eric Adams had attended their events. He had received donations from their current head, and that Eric Adams had been introduced to the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs by way of a assistant, an individual who has also met with that same entity connected to the United Front Work Department in China. What is going on there? Well, I suppose more needs to be done to try and figure that out. But that's not the only city where this is occurring. So to your point about presenting, whether it be a white or any other color face, to be the interlocutor, it's potentially occurring.
It is. And when we look at the ag land issue and the finances of universities and trade relations, I mean, it's just sort of common sense. You should know whose money you're receiving. You should know who you're going into business with. You should know an organization that you're going to associate with or receive some kind of a public award from. And if you don't know, and it could potentially be tied to the Chinese Communist Party, what I see as the largest external threat to the American way of life, maybe you ought to be careful, and maybe you ought to forego some of those opportunities until you know a little bit more and are prepared to explain or defend if you get put into that position. But if you don't know what the difference is between China and Taiwan, then you shouldn't go anywhere near something that talks about reunification. Mm-hmm. If you don't know anything about what a Chinese friendly association for courtship and exchange, or whatever the acronym might be, then maybe if it sounds super weird and very nonspecific, it probably does actually have a specific mission, and you're the entree on the table, not the guest. Mm-hmm. And so I think we can do a public service by helping make people alert to the mistakes that have been committed by others. And also that communities, your readership, our viewership, they can ask their local officials, their state officials, their congressional delegation, candidates that are coming by asking for their vote. Where do you stand on these issues? What do you see the nature of the Communist Party of China being? Do you think we can do free trade or free enterprise with unfree people? Right. How do we know who we're trading with, that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't allow transparency inside of China, and accommodationists in America have allowed them to avoid audit and transparency when engaging in America. So challenge your leaders to explain how they're keeping us safe. I think I'll sort of wind into our outro with, we just saw this balloon go over the United States. You mentioned earlier, COVID was a bit of a wake-up call. I know that there had been sort of these theoretical and real military tests that China engages in that looks at long-range missiles. There was an honorary general once that threatened, Americans wouldn't want to exchange Los Angeles for Taipei. But now they're showing that we can reach out and touch someone. We can float something across your whole country for multiple days, and you're not going to do anything about it till it goes off your shore, are you? And if they can do that with a balloon, imagine what they're doing with sending people to have a friendly assistant to make good relations with members of Congress, with mayors, with governors, leaders of universities. So I just think this is an extremely important area. I want to thank you for the good work that you've been doing. Thank you for joining this launch podcast at the China Desk hosted by Federal Newswire. Encourage everyone to follow Philip's work at the Daily Caller News Foundation and come back again to catch our future episodes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.